Jack Roslovic is a low-risk, high-reward signing that teams like the Edmonton Oilers need to make.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Tuesday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. This October is my fourth season as a host here on the Locked On Podcast Network, and I could not be more grateful to everybody that is making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers is a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where we've got your team covered every single day, and today's show is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. Visit FanDuel.com, download the FanDuel app for your chance at $300 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. On today's very, very, very busy edition of Locked On Oilers ahead of their showdown with the New York Rangers, I will be in the building, very thankful for that. We're going to talk about Jack Roslovic, who had a nice season last year in Carolina, who is a really interesting player and somebody who represents a lot of different ideas that we have about hockey in 2025. So to start out, we're going to talk about just the tools and the traits. We're not going to talk about the production. We're not going to talk about the role. Just what is Jack Roslovic down to the raw skills. Our second segment, we will pivot to talking about that production, and then the third and final segment, we will talk about what are realistic expectations and how the Oilers can best use him. So to start out, I find these types of players fascinating. Guys who fundamentally have great physical traits. And Roslovic does not jump off the screen. He's not Tom Wilson size. He doesn't skate like McDavid. He doesn't shoot like Austin Matthews. But his raw traits are tantalizing. You understand why Jack Roslovic was a first-round pick a number of years ago of the Winnipeg Jets. Now, a number of years ago sounds a bit disingenuous when we're talking about the 2015 draft. That's 10 years ago at this point. But make no mistake about it. Teams are going to be willing to give guys with that type of pedigree more runway than others. And we talk about this a lot on a macro level when it comes to undersized defensemen. When we talk about guys like Zach Jones, who were formerly of the New York Rangers, those undersized puck-moving defensemen, they're typically right-handed, though not always. But that skill set, there's a lot of it, and teams don't value it a whole lot. But when we talk about forwards, when we talk about valuable traits, straight line skating and shooting the puck are always going to have value. Now, teams are very reticent to give you opportunities. If that's all you have. I think you can look at guys like Kasperi Kapanen, Jeff Skinner, formerly Mike Hoffman to some degree, I would say, when he was at his best with Ottawa. This archetype, the strong straight line skater with good foot speed and somebody with a good shot, is a valuable toolbox. The problem that a lot of teams run into, and why guys like this often bounce around from team to team and look at full-time work, or long-term work, I should say, not full-time, but is the fact that these guys, generally speaking, do not make their own offense. They do not create for other players. They are often pretty limited outside of their skating and their not just skating and foot speed, skating and shooting. Those two traits are very valuable. You can hang around the NHL for 10, 15 years if this is all you can do. You look at the career Jeff Skinner's carving out, and I won't say Jeff Skinner's had a bad NHL career. I think he's put together a pretty solid track record based on the teams he's been on, the roles he's been asked to play. And very clearly, he is not hell-bent on winning a Stanley Cup. If he was, he wouldn't have signed with the Sharks. But you understand what I'm saying here. These types of guys who have that foot speed and who have that shooting ability, these types of guys are really nice additions. They're not who you build your team around. They're not foundational unless they have something else. If you're big and you have that, if you're a net front power play guy and you can on occasion go for 30 goals in the regular season as opposed to 20, that's something that's going to give you a bit of value. But as we continue this conversation and move along, I want to focus in on two things in particular. So if you go to NHL Edge, which is the NHL's proprietary data tracking, so if you're ever watching an NHL game and you see a cut to the back of a player's jersey and you see a perfect square somewhere on one of their shoulders, that is tracking them manually. That is a digital sensor that monitors a bunch of things: skating speed, the shot release is in the puck, but you get the point. The NHL is cataloging these types of stats, and Jack Roslovic grades out very well. 80th percentile in max skating speed, 85th percentile in speed bursts between 20 and 22 miles per hour, which is considered the upper echelon. And then his shot release measures in at 91.4 miles per hour, which is 86th percentile. All of those traits are enticing enough for teams to take chances. All of those traits are enough for teams to say, this guy is a former first-round pick. Maybe the team before didn't get that. And this comes to one of my favorite points of conversation when it comes to player evaluation and understanding where value comes from. When it comes to putting together a roster, a lot of teams will look at a guy like Jack Roslovic and say, he's not going to make anyone better. I can't play him on my third or fourth line. If I have Jack Roslovic, he needs to play in the top six with my team's best forwards. He needs to play with those guys because he's not defensively responsible enough. He's not going to forecheck. He's not going to throw his body around. He's not going to put pressure on defenders. All of that is frustrating for a coach. But to me, and look, this is me. I am not an NHL head coach. I am not an NHL general manager, but I say this very candidly and very point blank. Your goal as an NHL team is to score more goals than your opponent. Would you like to have 12 Alex Barkovs who are capable of playing hockey at an elite level, both ends of the ice? Of course. Teams falter and teams make mistakes when they start to focus in on things other than trying to score more goals. Yes, you need to be defensively responsible. Yes, it helps to have good goaltending. Yes, you need to forecheck. Yes, you need to kill penalties. All of that stuff is true. But when push comes to shove, even if you are a world-class defensive team, when you get into a best-of-7 series against the best teams in the league, they are going to score 4 or 5 goals a game. And even if you have an elite defense and you can slow the game down and hold them to 3 or 4 per game as opposed to 4 per 5, you're still going to need to score 3 or 4. And I understand someone like Jack Roslovic isn't really going to have a material impact as far as helping other guys out. But if you have the complementary pieces to coax performance out of him, you can make this work. Not everybody is a self-starting player. Not everybody is going to be able to create offense for themselves. So when I talk about creating offense for themselves, that's multifaceted. That's getting to the open areas of the ice to receive passes. That's a way of making yourself available. We've seen David Tomaszek do a nice job of that on the power play so far, even though he hasn't scored. There is finding ways to carry the puck into the offensive zone with speed. That's something Jack Roslovic has some experience with. I think in my anecdotal recollection of his month and a half, 2 months as a member of the Rangers, the limited spurts I've seen of him in Carolina and Columbus over the years, this is a player who's pretty fast in a straight line. He's not going to be physically imposing. He's not going to be awkward or uncomfortable for the other team to play against, particularly if they have guys of a specific skill set defensively. But there are traits here that might be able to coax better performance out of. And when you're a team like the Oilers, that is clearly going for it, that is trying to win the Stanley Cup, this is your market. The undervalued but skilled player that is waiting to be tapped into is kind of your bread and butter when you're a Stanley Cup contending team with superstar players. It's not ideal. It's not perfect. Of course, you would like to have a 35-40 goal winger for Leon or Connor. It's not out of the question Connor or Leon could coax 15 to 20 goals out of Jack Roslovic in limited work. That's not the craziest thing I've ever heard. But we are going to take our first break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, I'm going to talk about Jack Roslovic's production and what I think is realistic for him going forward. The NFL season is here, and FanDuel has an offer you don't want to miss, because right now, new FanDuel customers can bet just $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win. That's right. Pick a bet, put down $5, and if it hits, you'll unlock $300 in bonus bets to use on the FanDuel app. I love using FanDuel because it gives you so many ways to play. You can build parlays for a squad ride when you're watching a game with your friends. You can try the player prop market if picking the games isn't working for you, or if you feel the momentum in a game shifting, FanDuel's live betting makes it happen so you can capitalize on those swings. This week in the NFL, Thursday Night Football is interesting from a narrative perspective. The first and second picks from last year's draft, Caleb Williams and Jane Daniels squaring off. Jane Daniels and the Commanders, 5.5-point favorites. Then an interesting one later in the day on Sunday that I think is worth discussing, even though the Chargers are probably going to be without their two tackles. Again, the Colts, who seem to be for real with Daniel Jones, are 1.5-point road favorites on the West Coast at the Chargers. That might be something worth keeping an eye on, which leads me to ask FanDuel's one question. What are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com to download the FanDuel app today and get started. Thank you so much to everybody who is hanging out on this Tuesday edition. I almost said Thursday, but I caught myself. This Tuesday edition of Locked On Oilers. I hope everybody is ramping their minds up. And I know we've only played 2 games, as a lot of people were eager to remind me of in the comments about on yesterday's show, that I was excited the Oilers played well and played a style of hockey that would be sustainable early in the season. And yes, we are all going to ultimately judge this Oilers season based on May or June, or God forbid, April. But we can't do that yet. The work to get there, to eventually win a Stanley Cup, that foundation is being laid down now. And while I don't think Jack Roslovic is an impact player, I do think Jack Roslovic is a player who can have a handful of games where he makes a noticeable impact. We talked about the physical traits, the skating, the release. Those will play. Now, the question then becomes, what can you do with this guy? And we know the Oilers have a gluttony of forwards to pick from once you get past McDavid, Draisaitl, and Nugent-Hopkins. We know Matthias Janmark may or may not be returning relatively soon from LTIR. We've already seen Adam Henrique begin to be faded out, only getting about 9.45 per game. Noah Phillip leapfrogging Henrique in the pecking order. But you have Howard, you have Savoy, you have Podkolzin, you have Kapanen. That's 4 right there. You consider David Tomaszek. That's 5. Draisaitl, McDavid, 6 and 7. Henrique, 8. Phillip, 9. And really quickly, you start to ask yourself, well, if they sign Jack Roslovic, he's probably going to play, right? And this leads me to one of our first few points of delineation. There is a world where, and I made this comparison earlier, there's a world where Jack Roslovic is this year's Jeff Skinner. Somebody who needs to play in your top 6, should probably be on one of your 2 power play units, if not your first power play unit, to maximize what they're good at. But because of the deficiencies in their respective games, not being physical, not being great defensively, there is an implied understanding you don't get the right to be on a power play. You don't get that opportunity to play on a first power play unit if you don't do the other stuff, if you don't do the hard work, if we can't count on you. And I talk about this a lot. Everydayers have heard me say this for 2 years now. NHL teams, once they've invested in you, once they've given you that multi-year contract, they are materially invested in your outcomes. When they give you a 7-year deal at market value or better, they're going to put you on their power play so you put up counting stats. For Jack Roslovic, who is here on a 1-year deal, he is not necessarily going to get the benefit of the doubt as far as opportunities go. I would like to say the Oilers should give him a lot of opportunity to figure out what he could be on this team. But at the same time, I also think there's a conversation to be had about where a player like this works. And Roslovic's counting stats for his career are solid. 16 goals, 25 assists is his 82 game pace. We can assume he's not going to play 82 games because he's already missed 2. He very well might not be an everyday player, might be more of a 50 to 60 game player the way Jeff Skinner was. Okay, so let's put that down at 11 goals and 18 or 19 assists. Let's say 40 points. That's workable. You get 40 points from a guy who's only going to play 12 or 13 minutes per night. On a per game basis, that's pretty good. You know, Jeff Skinner gave the Oilers good production last year, even though it wasn't the most efficient, and even though he didn't really get to carve out the role he thought he would here. But I think when you look at Roslovic's numbers, and just for argument's sake, last year there were 217 NHL players who had 15 goals. Roslovic had 16. Okay, so he's at least the 215th best player. Last year in the NHL, 1,023 players played in an NHL game last season. Obviously, that includes goalies, defensemen, guys who played one game, guys who played 82 games. So just for perspective, 217 of those 1,023 had at least 15 goals. We'll say 1/5. Do we think Jack Roslovic is in the upper 20% of all NHL players? I think that's a reasonable estimate as far as goal scorers go. Upper 20th percentile as far as goal scorer go. That's what the numbers say. Then 199 players in the NHL last year had at least 25 assists. So again, we're right around that 20% mark. Do we think Jack Roslovic is one of the 200 best skaters in the NHL? So we're taking out goalies, but we're saying forwards and defensemen. I think there's a reasonable chance the answer is yes. And if we cut that number down to just forwards, I think the answer is unequivocally yes. So there are 32 teams in the NHL. On any given night, those 32 teams are going to dress 12 forwards. Obviously, they're not going to dress the same 12 forwards for all 82 games, but we can say as a baseline that there are going to be 384 forwards playing in a given NHL sequence of 16 games where all 32 teams play. Of those 384 skaters, those 384 forwards, do we think Jack Roslovic is in the upper half? That's possible. And I know we're banking this largely on just goals and assists, which are not the best indicators of value. They're indicators of production, and you can be inefficient in your production, which makes you less valuable. You know, the guy who only takes one shot per game, but it goes in every time, is going to be more valuable than the guy who gets 10 shots on goal per game, but only one goes in every other game. Percentages wise, that's not going to work out for you. So I do think that's an important part of this conversation. But Roslovic had 129 shots on goal last year. He scored on 12.4 of them. League average shooting percentage last year was 10.7. 10.7% minus 12.4, you get to about 1.7%. And 1.7% is not a lot. But in the case of someone like Jack Roslovic, 1.7% shooting difference is the difference between the AHL and the NHL. And that might sound a bit hyperbolic, a bit dramatic, but 10 years into an NHL career, has not had any really standout or remarkable seasons, has good traits, but hasn't ever really carved out a great role for himself. When you marry all of that together, you get the perception of a player who has talent, hasn't necessarily channeled it the best, hasn't found the right landing spot, and is now at the stage of his career where he is going to alternate between contenders, trying to find a role in a top nine, to carve out exactly the role that is going to coax both the most production and value out of him, so that a contender the following year is going to be willing to take a chance on him. And look, there's a world where Jack Roslovic goes the way of Sverre Kapanen. And I know they're relatively similar in age, but these are players of a similar archetype. Strong frontline skater, strong shooter, but nothing else. And Kapanen has added that grinding motor to his game. He's become a bit more of a forecheck first player as his shot and his other production-wise skills have dissipated. He has made himself a bit more valuable as a forechecker. Do I think Roslovic has that in his game? Not really, no. So that means Roslovic needs to find a way to make his counting stat production work. We are going to take our second and final break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, I'm going to tell you straight up what I think the Oilers should do with Jack Roslovic in the lineup for the rest of this season. Most people can't name all their financial accounts or even what they're worth, whether you're investing in 401ks, properties, or traditional investments. And when you don't have the full picture, you can end up leaving money on the table. That's where our friends at Monarch Money come in. It's an all-in-one personal finance tool that brings your entire financial life together in one clean, easy-to-use interface on your laptop or phone. Monarch is built for people with busy lives. If you've put off organizing your finances or the thought makes you anxious, Monarch is here for you. Monarch does all of the heavy lifting. You can link your accounts in minutes, see clear data visualizations, get categorization of your spending, and finally feel in control of your money without ever touching a spreadsheet. Monarch Money made me aware I wasn't saving as much money as I needed to, both for big purchases, things like vacation or, the headphones I'm wearing while I record this. And Monarch helps you determine what would be inefficient spending, put money aside, get on a plan, and not finance expensive purchases. Do not let financial opportunity slip through the cracks. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com in your browser for half off your first year subscription. One more time, that's 50% off your first year at monarchmoney.com with code LOCKEDONNHL at checkout. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Oilers as we are making our way through the early stages of the NHL season. As I said at the top, I will be at the game tonight against the Rangers, so the episode might come out a little bit later than it usually does because I do need to travel back from the game, but looking forward to seeing Connor and the guys in person, getting a feel for where they're at. And I always talk about this. I've told this story on the show so many times, but I really do think it's illuminating in terms of my perspective about hockey. But a couple years ago, I went to the Rangers home opener against the Dallas Stars. It was the offseason after they had acquired Ryan Reeves, Barclay Goodrow, Sammy Blais. They really remodeled the team to try and get tougher, more rugged after the Tom Wilson Panarin thing the spring prior. And my friend was asking me, what's the difference between a really bad hockey player and a really good hockey player? And he was talking about it in terms of the sports we watch more casually. We talk about more liberally. Football, for example, where a quarterback, it's about timing and being able to throw before guys are open and anticipating. In hockey, it's the fluidity. It's the effortlessness of certain players that tell you that they're good. You watch somebody like Ryan Reeves who has to skate their butt off to just stay in the play, not even make the play, just to keep up with the play. And you compare that to McDavid, who it looks like the stick and the puck are extensions of his body. And I think that's where we start to lose sight in these conversations, because I don't really see a world where Jack Roslovic should need to be bouncing around from team to team for opportunities. 15 goals is pretty valuable in the landscape of the NHL today. I know scoring is getting a little bit easier, and we'll see if power play numbers are down like they were last year on a league-wide basis in terms of the number of opportunities, so fewer goals. But by and large, and my personal thoughts on this archetype, is that teams get a little too high and mighty for themselves. Yes, we want well-rounded quality hockey players who don't have weaknesses. But if we need to prioritize between weaknesses and strengths, and we have the option to pick a high motor forechecker who's going to give us 25 points all year, or we can pick the straight line shooting winger who's going to give us 45 to 50 points, but their defense and their forechecking is not great. I think we really need to consider picking the guy who can put goals in the net, who can put the puck on net and get dangerous offense. And look, I know guys like Roslovic, the play's going to die on their stick a lot. They are going to get the pass in a semi-dangerous area, and Roslovic's just going to let it rip because that's his trait. He's not a passer. He's not a facilitator. He's not a cycle guy. He's not a forecheck guy. This is someone who's going to get their puck on the stick, skate as fast as they can in a straight line, and try and get it on net. With that release and with that straight line skating against a lot of opposition, that's going to work. That's going to be fine. And the Oilers, by virtue of having McDavid and Draisaitl and Bouchard, are going to be able to give Roslovic opportunities to use his best traits. And I don't see a world where Roslovic can really play on the fourth line. And we saw that last year with Jeff Skinner, where Chris Knobloch was very transparent that Jeff Skinner's skill set is not what he wants out of his fourth line. So if the choice is between Skinner playing at all or playing on the fourth line, he's going to sit. And I think Roslovic is gifted enough of a hockey player that he can play in the Oilers' top nine. Now, I think based on who the center is on the given line Roslovic plays on, I think that ultimately is going to have a strong bearing on what his production ultimately turns out to be. Obviously, in an ideal world, you'd love to play everyone with Connor and Leon, but I do understand that there are guys in the pecking order who have more priority. There are guys in the pecking order that the Oilers have staked more equity in. The Oilers are more materially invested in the development of Matthew Savoy, of Ike Howard, I would say Podkolzin as well, even though he's not as obviously a high trajectory player. With those guys ahead of him, Zach Hyman soon to return, it becomes very dicey as to how Jack Roslovic stays in the lineup as a top 9 forward. And I think there's a world where he should be a top 9 forward in the NHL. I don't even think that's a hot take. I think of the 32 teams in the NHL, Jack Roslovic should absolutely be able to be a top 9 forward. Now, if you're a team trying to win the Stanley Cup like the Oilers, the Panthers, the Stars, the Jets, the Wild, the Golden Knights, maybe he doesn't crack your top 9. And in that case, I understand. If you're the Oilers and you have your heart set on playing a very particular way because of what you've learned over the last 2 years, I'm not really going to be able to be the one to tell you you're not right. Now, do I think there's more to gain from someone like Roslovic playing over, say, Janmark or Kapanen? For sure. But we know teams don't like playing these skills shoot guys on their fourth line because the fourth line has a different role. Well, yes, the fourth line should chip in goals every now and then just for equity's sake, fairness sake, so the other guys don't have to do all the work. The fourth line's out there to time waste. They're out there to get the puck in deep, to absorb difficult defensive zone matchups, to cycle, to forecheck, to not play defense. And those are not things Jack Roslovic does particularly well. So that means he's got to play in your top 9. So who's the third line center? Is it Henrique? Is it Nuge? Okay. Is it Tomashek? What are you going to do there? And that creates the conversation the Oilers are going to have for a lot of this season between Savoy and Howard and Roslovic and Kapanen, who all have varying degrees of stake in the team, and the stakeholders have a varying degree of investment in. But we know, at least if the Oilers are a well-run team, they're going to prioritize Howard and Savoy over Jack Roslovic. That's just the nature of the beast. That will do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. Be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please leave the show a 5-star review. If you're watching over on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. I will talk to you guys tomorrow after the game against the Rangers. Be sure to check out Locked On NHL and Locked On NHL Game Night. Until then, let's go Oilers.